Jennifer Watson was blindsided by a court summons, accused of missing rent she never missed. Her greedy landlord, Justin Burton, had forged documents to push her out and hike the rent for profit. Burton, a man who thrived on exploiting vulnerable tenants, was certain his money and lies would crush her. But Jennifer had one unexpected weapon: Mark Stevens, a fearless attorney with a knack for exposing fraud. And trust me, you won't believe the shocking twist that left Burton's empire in ruins, and how justice hit him harder than he ever saw coming. Jennifer Watson had been having an average, uneventful day when the call came, a day she would later describe as the beginning of the worst chapter of her life. It started with an unfamiliar number flashing on her phone. Normally, she wouldn't have picked up, but something told her to answer. She regretted that decision almost instantly. "This is Justin Burton's office," came a stiff, curt voice on the other end. "We're notifying you of a breach in your lease agreement. You're required to vacate your apartment immediately." Jennifer froze, her mind racing to catch up with the words. Vacate? Breach of lease? It had to be some kind of mistake. She shook her head, trying to process. She had been living in this apartment for over 3 years. Never once had she missed rent. Never once had she caused trouble. She worked hard, balanced 2 jobs, and did her best to create a safe home for her 6-year-old son, Eli. "I think there's been some kind of error," she said, gripping the phone tighter. "I've paid my rent on time every month. There's no breach. This can't be right. Gee." The silence that followed was suffocating. She could hear faint typing on the other end of the line, as though the person was busy with something far more important than her livelihood. When the voice returned, it was even colder than before. "You violated the lease. The court date is set. You'll receive a summons shortly," the man repeated, with the mechanical indifference of someone reading a script. No explanation, no empathy, just a statement of facts. Jennifer's chest tightened. "But how did I violate the lease? What exactly are you accusing me of?" Click. The call ended. For a long moment, she just stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in, creeping slowly at first, then hitting her all at once like a wave. What if this wasn't just a mistake? What if they really could kick her out with no warning? She immediately began rifling through her documents. The lease agreement, rent payment receipts, bank statements. She had them all meticulously organized. Every rent payment was accounted for. There was nothing suspicious, no indication of a breach. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Jennifer tried contacting the landlord's office again, but no one would give her any information. Her mind spiraled with worst-case scenarios. What if she and Eli ended up homeless? The thought made her physically ill. Every time she looked at her son, who was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them, she felt a pang of guilt and terror. She had promised to protect him, and now it felt like that promise was slipping through her fingers. Then the summons arrived. It was a thin envelope, almost inconspicuous, except for the official seal stamped across the front. Jennifer tore it open, her hands shaking. The words blurred on the page, but she caught the essentials. Court appearance required, eviction proceedings initiated. She dropped the paper and slumped into a chair. This wasn't just a bad dream, it was real. She was being taken to court, and she had no idea why. No explanations, no warnings, just cold, bureaucratic indifference. It was like waking up in someone else's nightmare, a nightmare where the rules didn't make sense, where you could lose everything without anyone telling you why. The courtroom was sterile and suffocating. Jennifer sat rigidly at the defendant's table, feeling like a child being scolded by an authority figure who didn't care to hear her side. The judge, an older man with a weary gaze, scanned the stack of documents in front of him while Justin Burton's attorney strutted to the podium like he already owned the verdict. Burton himself sat nearby in a perfectly tailored suit, exuding an air of arrogant detachment. He had the look of a man who never got his hands dirty, someone who wielded power through lawyers, contracts, and legal loopholes. Jennifer felt a surge of nausea just glancing at him. How many families had he destroyed to build his empire? The lawyer cleared his throat and began his spiel with an oily charm. "Your Honor, as you can see, the defendant has failed to pay rent for the past 3 months. a clear violation of her lease agreement. He handed a folder to the judge, his smile cold and calculated. The payment records and lease documentation confirmed this beyond any doubt. Jennifer's eyes widened in shock and fury. She leaned forward in her chair, heart pounding in her ears. Payment records, lease documentation, it was all a complete fabrication. She knew she had paid every cent on time, but before she could process the full weight of the lie, the lawyer pressed on. My client, Mr. Burton, has been more than patient in this matter. Unfortunately, Miss Watson's failure to comply leaves us no choice but to pursue legal eviction. Jennifer shot to her feet. That's a lie. I've paid every month. You're falsifying records. The courtroom turned toward her, and she felt the judge's disapproving stare burn into her. Miss Watson, he said sharply, please remain seated and let counsel finish speaking. She slowly lowered herself back down, her hands clenched into fists on the table. Her mind raced. How could they do this? How could they get away with this? Her stomach churned as the lawyer's words droned on. He talked about her like she wasn't even in the room, like she was a problem to be disposed of, an obstacle in the way of Burton's next payday. By the time the judge called a recess, Jennifer's hope was unraveling. She had no legal experience, no money to hire a decent lawyer, and clearly the court had little interest in her side of the story. The deck was stacked against her in every possible way. As she exited the courtroom, wiping away frustrated tears, she heard a voice behind her. Miss Watson, a word? Jennifer turned to find Burton's attorney standing in the corridor, his face contorted into a condescending smile. He adjusted his silk tie and stepped closer, his tone patronizing and syrupy. Look, I know this must be difficult for you, but Mr. Burton is willing to be reasonable. Reasonable, she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. If you agree to voluntarily move out, Mr. Burton might be willing to grant you a brief extension, say a few days to find other accommodations. Jennifer stared at him, trembling with barely contained rage. You're disgusting, she spat. Her words hit like venom, but the lawyer merely smirked and walked off, leaving her fuming and helpless in the hallway. She sank onto a bench, head in her hands. They're going to win. They always win. A deep pit of despair opened inside her, and for the first time, she felt the crushing weight of hopelessness. What could she possibly do against men like Burton, armed with money, power, and connections? Rough day? The voice was calm, warm, and unfamiliar. Jennifer looked up to see a tall man with sharp eyes and a confident yet approachable demeanor standing before her. He looked out of place in the cold, hostile courthouse. Unlike the other attorneys she had seen today, this man carried no aura of superiority or apathy. I'm Mark Stevens, he introduced himself, extending a hand. I couldn't help overhearing. Justin Burton, huh? Let me guess. He's accusing you of unpaid rent with ironclad documents that don't add up. Jennifer blinked, momentarily stunned. That's exactly what's happening. How do you know? Mark chuckled dryly. Because Burton's pulled the same stunt on other tenants before. He fabricates payment records, then uses the courts to force people out so he can jack up the rent. I've been waiting for a case like this. She straightened in her seat, a glimmer of hope reigniting. You've seen this before? Can you help me? Absolutely, he said with a reassuring nod. I represent families like yours, pro bono. If we do this right, we're not just going to stop your eviction. We're going to expose Burton's entire operation. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jennifer allowed herself to breathe. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as powerless as she had thought. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the second hearing began. Jennifer sat beside Mark Stevens, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. The stakes couldn't have been higher, but this time she wasn't alone. Mark had spent the past week digging through Burton's records, and now he was ready to go on the offensive. The judge, seated high above the courtroom, gave a brief nod for the proceedings to commence. Burton sat across the room, his usual air of superiority intact, for now. His expensive lawyer, still smirking with that infuriating self-assurance, adjusted his tie and prepared to continue their charade. But Mark wasn't interested in letting them lead the dance. He rose from his seat, his every movement deliberate and commanding. Your Honor, he began, stepping forward with a file in hand. I'd like to present new evidence regarding Mr. Burton's pattern of fraudulent activity." The word fraudulent hit the room like a gunshot. A murmur rippled through the small crowd in the gallery. Even the judge, who had remained stoic through most of the case, shifted in his chair. Burton's lawyer chuckled nervously, but his eyes sharpened. "Objection," the lawyer interjected with a forced laugh. "This is pure speculation." "Speculation?" Mark raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but cutting. He handed the judge a thick folder. "This file contains forged lease agreements, doctored payment records, and testimony from multiple tenants who experienced similar treatment at the hands of Mr. Burton." The judge took the file and began leafing through it, his expression darkening with each passing second. Silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. Jennifer watched Burton out of the corner of her eye. For the first time, she saw something foreign in his carefully composed expression. Fear. It flickered briefly, but unmistakably. The mask was slipping. Burton's lawyer hurried to regain control. "Your Honor, these allegations are absurd. My client has operated his business ethically for years. These documents could easily be fabricated by disgruntled tenants." Mark took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Really? Let's test that theory. Perhaps you can explain this." He pulled out another set of papers and held them up for the court to see. Jennifer Watson's payment records show rent charged for an apartment located across town. An apartment she's never even set foot in, let alone rented. A hushed gasp spread through the room. All eyes shifted to Burton, whose face was rapidly draining of color. His lawyer fumbled, searching for a retort, but Mark wasn't done. "These records also show overlapping payment demands, tenants being charged for multiple properties simultaneously. In other words, Mr. Burton wasn't just evicting tenants on false claims of non-payment. He was double-dipping, collecting rent from new tenants, while fraudulently accusing the previous ones of default." The judge's gaze hardened as he turned his full attention to Burton. "Mr. Burton, do you care to respond to these allegations?" Burton opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His jaw moved awkwardly, as if the words had caught in his throat. Jennifer watched with a mix of awe and grim satisfaction. The man who had tried to destroy her life was unraveling in real time. Your Honor, these documents are being taken out of context," Burton finally stammered, sweat forming on his brow. "Out of context?" Mark echoed with a derisive chuckle. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why multiple tenants, unrelated to each other, are providing identical accounts of forged agreements and fabricated debts?" The judge leaned forward, his voice icy. "Mr. Burton, this is a serious matter. I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach before digging yourself into a deeper hole." Burton's lawyer quickly whispered something in his ear, but it was too late. The damage was done. Mark proceeded to methodically lay out the rest of the evidence, bank statements showing overlapping deposits, records of tenants being charged after their supposed evictions, and even an internal memo from Burton's property management team hinting at profit maximization strategies. It was a smoking gun. By the time Mark finished, the courtroom was dead silent. No one dared speak, as if afraid the slightest noise would shatter the moment. Jennifer felt a surge of emotions, relief, vindication, and most of all, hope. For the first time, it wasn't her word against theirs. The truth was out, and Burton couldn't bury it. "It's over," Mark whispered softly to her as they sat down. Jennifer nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. It wasn't just over for her, it was over for all the others Burton had wronged. Justice was finally catching up to him. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. "This court rules in favor of Jennifer Watson. Mr. Burton is ordered to pay compensation and will face a full investigation of his property dealings. Potential criminal charges are pending." Jennifer exhaled deeply, the weight of weeks of fear finally lifting. It was over. The nightmare had ended, and justice was on her side. Across the room, Burton sat frozen, his face pale. His empire of lies was collapsing, and he had no escape this time. Outside, people approached Jennifer with warm smiles and handshakes. "You're an inspiration," one woman said. "Thank you, Mark," Jennifer whispered, tears in her eyes. "Don't thank me," Mark replied. You fought for this and won. As Jennifer stepped into the sunlight, Burton sat nearby, slumped on a bench, staring into the distance. His world was crumbling, and he knew it. She didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, she walked forward without fear, free at last.